After years of silence, one woman's voice has changed everything. For decades, she stood behind one of the most respected pastors in the nation, smiling beside him, praying behind him, and protecting a truth that few ever knew. But now, at 56, Dr. Joel Tudman's wife has finally broken her silence, and what she revealed has left the entire faith community shaken to its core. Because this isn't just a story about marriage, it's a revelation about what happens when love, faith, and silence collide behind the pulpit. What she said about their life together, and why she chose to speak now, has exposed a side of ministry no one was prepared to see. So what really happened behind those church walls? Why did she stay silent for so long? And what could drive a pastor's wife, after years of loyalty, to finally speak her truth to the world? Stay with me, because once you hear what she said, you'll never look at this couple or the church the same way again. Before the headlines, before the microphones, before the name Dr. Joel Tudman echoed through churches across America, there was just a young man with a dream and a Bible in his hand. He wasn't born into fame or influence. His story began in humble surroundings, shaped by struggle and faith. Those who knew him back then say he carried a fire that could not be ignored, a conviction that he was meant to change lives. And slowly, that conviction began to manifest. In his early 20s, Tudman was known for more than just his sermons. He had presence, the kind that could fill a room before he even spoke. People described him as magnetic, deeply spiritual, and unstoppable in his pursuit of purpose. His words carried hope, especially for those who had lost theirs. He rose through the ranks of ministry not because of connections, but because of calling. Each message, each revival, each prayer meeting added another layer to the legend being built around him. By the time he reached his 40s, he was no longer just a preacher. He was a movement. But as his influence grew, so did the distance between the man and the mission. The larger the platform became, the harder it was to keep life simple. Invitations poured in from across the country. He preached to stadiums, appeared on panels, collaborated with other major faith leaders, and became a symbol of modern ministry success. And beside him through it all, quietly, faithfully, stood his wife. She was there at every turning point, organizing events, managing schedules, and encouraging him through sleepless nights. While his voice shook nations, hers was the calm behind it. Yet few ever noticed. To the public, they were a power couple, strong, united, blessed. But behind the polished smiles and matching Sunday outfits, the cracks were beginning to form. Because when the calling grows louder than the connection, even faith can feel like distance. And that's where the story truly begins. Not with fame, not with success, but with the moment the light on the stage began to cast shadows behind the pulpit. While Dr. Joel Tudman's name became synonymous with inspiration, his wife lived a different kind of calling, one that required silence, sacrifice, and strength away from the cameras. She was the steady rhythm behind his public roar. Every sermon he preached, every trip he took, every crowd that stood to applaud him, she was the unseen architect of the moments that built his reputation. Friends described her as gracious, intelligent, and deeply spiritual, yet often overlooked. Her life revolved around his ministry, not out of obligation, but out of devotion. In those early years, she believed in him completely. When the ministry struggled financially, she was the one balancing the books. When members left the church over disagreements, she was the one writing personal letters, urging reconciliation. When he doubted himself, she reminded him of his purpose. She was his intercessor, his confidant, his anchor. But what the world saw as partnership was, behind the scenes, slowly becoming imbalance. The more the ministry grew, the less space there was for her own identity. Invitations that once included both of them began arriving with only his name. Her voice, once valued in planning and prayer, was now heard less often. The sermons became longer, the travel schedule more demanding, and the home quieter. At first, she dismissed the growing ache in her heart as just exhaustion. After all, every great calling comes with sacrifice. But over time, that sacrifice began to feel one-sided. While he was celebrated as a vessel of God's power, she began to feel invisible, a shadow in the glow of someone else's spotlight. Those close to the couple noticed the changes first. She started speaking less during gatherings. Her eyes, once full of energy, began to carry the weight of someone fighting unseen battles. Even in church photos, her smile seemed practiced, gentle, but distant. People whispered quietly, "She looks tired," or "Maybe she's just more private now." But no one dared to ask the question that lingered in the air. Was she happy? Still, she kept her composure. She believed that submission meant silence, that loyalty meant endurance. And so she continued to pray for her husband, even when she didn't recognize the man behind the sermons anymore. It was during these years, when fame was at its peak, that she began to write in secret. Pages filled with quiet thoughts, unspoken prayers, and questions she could never ask out loud. She never meant for anyone to read them. They were her way of surviving a world that applauded her husband while overlooking her pain. But those journals would later become something else, the foundation for the words that would shake the entire faith community. Because sometimes the most powerful testimonies don't come from the preacher's microphone. They come from the heart of the one who stood silently beside him. Every ministry has two sides, the one the congregation sees on Sunday and the one that exists behind closed doors. For the Tudmans, that difference grew wider with every passing year. Outwardly, they looked flawless. Perfectly coordinated on stage, holding hands during prayer, exchanging loving glances in public, the image of a couple anointed and unbreakable. But inside their home, things were shifting quietly. The long nights apart became longer, the phone calls shorter, and the prayers that once united them now felt like they were happening in two different rooms and two different hearts. It started small. Missed dinners because of meetings, sermon preparation bleeding into family time. A weekend meant for rest turned into another out-of-town conference. She understood his calling, but she also began to sense that she was slowly losing her husband to the very ministry they had built together. He wasn't unfaithful, at least not in the way people gossip about. But his absence, his constant focus on the next sermon, the next event, the next goal, that became its own kind of distance. The kind that eats away at connection, not through betrayal, but through neglect. She would sit alone in the pews while he preached about unity and love, listening to a message that sounded less like faith and more like irony. He'd tell crowds, "God values relationship above all things," and she would wonder when the last time was that they had even finished a conversation without interruption. Friends close to them noticed. They described their home as quiet, too quiet. The once lively energy had turned to polite silence. Smiles were rehearsed. Laughter was rare. Even the walls seemed to carry tension that no one wanted to name. Still, she tried to believe things would get better. She told herself it was just a season, that God was testing their endurance. But deep down, she began to feel something she never thought possible: resentment. Not toward her husband as a man of God, but toward the version of him that the world demanded he be. He was surrounded by admiration, yet at home, she was surrounded by silence. The man who could fill arenas with words barely had any left for her. And that silence began to echo louder than any sermon he ever preached. In private moments, she began asking herself questions she had once been afraid to think. Is this what faith looks like? Can love survive when one person's calling becomes the other's shadow? She had always believed that their ministry was built on truth. But now she was beginning to wonder if it was built on performance, a beautiful illusion that looked perfect to the world, but was quietly cracking beneath the surface. And it was those cracks, small, silent, but spreading fast, that would one day lead her to the moment no one expected. The moment when silence finally broke. There comes a moment in every long-suffering silence when the silence itself becomes unbearable. For Dr. Joel Tudman's wife, that moment didn't arrive with a dramatic argument or public scandal. It came quietly, in the solitude of a parked car, just steps from her own front door. It was after another long church event. She had smiled, posed for pictures, greeted congregation members, and stood beside her husband like she had done for over 2 decades. But the mask was getting harder to hold in place. Her soul was tired, not from the work, but from the weight of invisibility. That night, instead of going straight inside, she sat alone in her car. No cameras, no congregation, just her and the truth. And for the first time in years, she cried, not out of anger, not even out of betrayal, but because she realized she had been disappearing. Piece by piece, year by year, she was the woman who had helped build the very foundation that everyone praised. The one who had written late-night speeches, arranged outreach events, counseled young women, and comforted families. But in the process, she had forgotten how to comfort herself. She had prayed for the church. But who had prayed for her? She had poured into others. But who was pouring into her? That night marked a shift, a quiet, holy rebellion. She didn't call the press. She didn't post a bitter Facebook status. Instead, she began to write letters, journals, voice memos. Not about revenge, but about remembering who she used to be before the title pastor's wife consumed her identity. And she made a vow to herself, not to destroy her husband, not to dismantle the ministry, but to reclaim her voice. Because too many women in the church world are taught that silence equals strength, that submission means invisibility. But she knew now that staying quiet wasn't making her stronger. It was making her disappear. And so, after years of smiling through pain, she made a decision. To speak, not with bitterness, but with clarity, not to tear down, but to finally stand up. That moment in the car, with the engine off and the tears rolling down her face, would become the birthplace of her truth. And when she finally released it, the entire faith community would never be the same again. When the moment finally came for Dr. Joel Tudman's wife to break her silence, it wasn't explosive, it wasn't petty, and it wasn't meant to destroy. It was measured, heartfelt, and profoundly human. After years of suffering quietly behind the curtain of ministry, she chose a platform that would allow her to speak on her own terms. No sensational interviews, no accusatory press releases. Just her voice, raw, real, and finally free. And what she said shook everyone. She didn't speak with bitterness. She spoke with wisdom, the kind that only comes from deep scars and deeper faith. She didn't accuse. She revealed. Her words weren't about attacking her husband's character. They were about acknowledging the silent burden she had carried for so long. She spoke to the women who, like her, had been taught that strength means silence. To those who stood in church pews every Sunday smiling, while their souls were quietly breaking. To the ones who supported great men, yet felt invisible beside them. She talked about identity, how easy it is to lose yourself when your life revolves around someone else's calling. She talked about worth, how spiritual loyalty doesn't mean emotional neglect should be tolerated. And she talked about loneliness, the kind that builds up not from being alone, but from being unheard for far too long. Her message wasn't gossip, it was ministry, and it resonated in ways no one could have predicted. Women across the country began to respond. Some wrote letters, others shared their own testimonies. Church groups started conversations about balance, partnership, and the emotional toll ministry can take on a spouse. Some church leaders tried to downplay her words, saying she should have kept her pain private for the sake of the brand. But others stood up and applauded her courage. Because for once, the narrative was not about the man in the pulpit. It was about the woman who carried the cross in silence. And something shifted, not just in their marriage, but in the broader conversation about what spiritual leadership actually costs behind the scenes. What began as one woman's breaking point became a powerful wave of reckoning across an entire community. Because when she finally spoke, the silence of thousands was broken with her. When word spread that Dr. Joel Tudman's wife had finally spoken out, the reaction was immediate and impossible to ignore. Whispers turned to headlines. Congregations buzzed. Old sermons were revisited. And the man who had always seemed so composed, so untouchable, suddenly found himself under a different kind of spotlight. For the first time in his ministry, Dr. Tudman wasn't just the preacher, he was the subject of the message. Many wondered how he would respond. Would he issue a public denial? Would he ignore it entirely, hoping the news cycle would move on? Would he call it an attack, a betrayal? Instead, what he did stunned everyone. He got into the pulpit, not with fire, but with weight. His opening scripture was from James 1:2-4. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. His tone wasn't defensive, it was somber. He didn't name his wife. He didn't mention the situation directly. But for those listening closely, he didn't have to. He preached about disruption, about how God sometimes allows hidden fractures to rise to the surface, not to destroy, but to reveal what was left unattended. He spoke about humility, forgiveness, and the kind of storms that don't show up on weather radars. The emotional ones, the spiritual ones. Sometimes the greatest pain isn't public, he said. It's the pain in the places you preach from. Some in the crowd wept. Others clapped. Online, reactions were split. Some called it graceful, a pastor showing vulnerability. Others called it calculated, a sermon designed to dodge accountability while protecting his image. But behind the pulpit, the real story was unfolding in private. According to sources close to the couple, Dr. Tudman was shaken. Not because his wife lied, but because she told the truth. And that truth, after years of being tucked away in silence, hit him harder than any scandal ever could. He reportedly felt blindsided, embarrassed, even betrayed. Because for so long, he had controlled the narrative. He was the leader, the voice, the center. And suddenly, the one person who had stood behind him was now standing in her own power. And the world was listening. But over time, something shifted. As the noise began to settle, he started reading her words, really reading them. Not as a threat, but as a mirror. And what he saw wasn't a bitter woman trying to ruin him. It was the woman he once loved, asking to be seen again. Friends say that moment broke something in him, in a good way. He reached out to her, not with anger, but with humility. They didn't reconcile overnight. They didn't fix years of pain in one phone call, but they started talking, for the first time in a long time, without the pressure of appearances. And while the world expected a PR statement or a damage control podcast, he gave them something far more unexpected: a changed posture, a softer tone, and sermons that for the first time in years felt less like performances and more like prayers. He didn't deny the pain. He leaned into it. And in doing so, he reminded the world that even pastors, even spiritual giants, are just human beings trying to get it right. And that honesty, that vulnerability, might just be the most powerful sermon he's ever preached. In the weeks that followed her emotional revelation and his unexpected response, something truly rare began to unfold. Not a scandal spiraling out of control, but a story of healing. Not the kind you post about, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that happens in the quiet, behind the scenes, in the shadows of once broken trust. At first, the public expected fallout. Some thought their ministry would fracture. Others predicted separation. But instead, they chose something different: honest restoration. Behind closed doors, Dr. Tudman and his wife began to talk, not as pastor and first lady, not as public figures, but as two people trying to remember who they were before the applause, before the expectations, before the emotional distance. Sources close to them say those early conversations were raw. There were tears, regret, long silences, but also listening. For the first time in years, she was speaking, and he was hearing her. Not just her words, but the pain behind them. He began to realize that while he had been preaching to the masses, the one person he should have been ministering to had been quietly fading in his own home. She, in turn, began to see glimpses of the man she had married. Not the polished preacher, but the humble dreamer with purpose in his eyes. The one who used to hold her hand in prayer before the crowd came. They didn't rush to fix everything. There was no announcement of "we're back." No Instagram posts with Bible verses and smiling faces. They simply started over, Dr. Tudman reportedly took intentional time away from certain public duties. He focused more on home, on reflection, on counseling. His sermons shifted, not just in tone, but in truth. He began talking about accountability, emotional neglect, the cost of ego, and the danger of spiritual burnout.